This week's issue is an interview with Professor Basima Tewfik. She's a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She writes about workplace imposter thoughts, and I thought that would be an interesting topic to highlight and to discuss. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
I thought I would start with um, highly competent people who have had these imposter thoughts. So one of the things I was doing as I was prepping for today is I looked up all the people who, on the outside, you'd think are successful or made it in life, and then I wanted to see if they'd written about their own feelings of self-doubt. So I want to read you one quote from Maya Angelou. She says, "I've written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody, and they're going to find me out." Um, so I wanted to ask you, how do these thoughts even get into our heads?
That's a really interesting question. So I think it's first helpful to start with what I think those thoughts are. So almost providing a definition, and then I can talk about sort of what the academics would call the antecedents, or what are the precursors of these thoughts. So when I hear a sort of statement like that from Maya Angelou, I kind of think of what I call as workplace imposter thoughts, which I define as the belief that others overestimate your abilities or talents at work. So it's this idea that maybe I was capable in the past, but now other people are sort of expecting me to be this level of capable every single time. And so for Maya Angelou, I think what she's getting at, obviously I'm not Maya, so I can't say exactly what's going on in her head, but this kind of idea of, you know, I had a lot of success. And so I kind of feel this pressure to keep performing at that level that I believe that others expect me to be. But what's actually sort of driving imposter thoughts, or what I think makes imposter thoughts particularly interesting, is this idea that we know all of the things that we're not good at. So because we are people and we understand ourselves, we remember every failure, every moment of doubt that we've had, every time that maybe we didn't do as well as we thought we could on a particular task in the past. Everyone else is not necessarily privy to all of those sort of thoughts or all of those past experiences. And even if they are privy, they might not assume that actually those are that important or diagnostic of whatever task that you're supposed to be doing next. And so I think for Maya, she's potentially thinking, okay, I think there's this like crazy high level of expectation of what my capabilities are. I understand maybe that I have been successful in the past, but maybe as I was engaging in that sort of performance that they're sort of evaluating me on or using as information, I sort of remember sort of what components were sort of luck driven, where I got lucky, where sort of things seemed to just fall into place. And I also remember the little stumbles or missteps that occurred in that performance that maybe other people aren't picking up on, but I remember pretty deeply.
Yeah, yeah. I want to pick up on the kind of the definition that you gave. So you talked about this gap between how we think of ourselves and how we think other people think of us, and that gap is what leads to imposter thoughts. And I've heard you kind of share that that's the central feature of this feeling versus terms that we sometimes hear like phoniness or that we're faking it. Is that generally accurate? That's kind of what we really mean when we talk about imposter thoughts?
Yeah, this is also another excellent question. So, part of my impetus for studying this phenomenon and really getting an understanding is the fact that there are so many different sort of definitions that are floating around. And in part, this is because a lot of the discussion around this phenomenon is happening in the popular press. And when you're sort of talking to a mainstream audience, there are other things that we might care more about, really making sure people are understanding what we're talking about, as opposed to maybe perhaps being really precise, which is what I think academic scholars try to do. They're like, no, we're talking about this and not this other thing. And so when it comes to faking it, so this idea that I'm going to get found out, I think that is likely a byproduct of having these thoughts of, I think other people think I'm smarter. So perhaps I also worry that other people are going to find me out. One thing when I was early on in this research, I was trying to figure out, is the fear of being found out part and parcel of the construct? So does it have to always come together with this idea that other people overestimate me, or can it always be sort of a byproduct? And I did some initial qualitative interviews right at the beginning. And what I noticed is that there were some people that said, yeah, I mean, other people overestimate me, but I'm going to just ride this out until they catch me. So they weren't necessarily indicating that they had this extreme fear that is sort of paralyzing them. They were just saying, yeah, maybe this is happening, but I am getting some benefits and I recognize these benefits. And so, like, let me just see where it goes. And so this kind of introduced this idea of, wait, might these actually be separable? And for some people, yeah, we see that fear really driving their subsequent behavior. But for other people, maybe it's actually motivational, or something else is going on, driving potentially positive effects. And so that kind of initial kernel is what led me to start going down this pathway of, do we actually have a kind of a misunderstanding of what this phenomenon is, or maybe better yet, an incomplete understanding? So we've all been focusing on this fear pathway, in part because people tend to conflate the fear of being found out with the idea that others overestimate you. But might there also be another pathway that's operating?
Fantastic. No, I love how precise you are. And in fact, even recent publications that I later learned had been read widely also focused on the phoniness and the fear of being found out piece. And I also kind of looked at the Google Trends for a number of terms. I looked up the trends for imposter thoughts, which is what you talk about specifically in the workplace, imposter syndrome, and the imposter phenomenon, which is what it was called in the original 78 paper. And syndrome is kind of way up, and everything else doesn't even show up on the graph. So was that definition used because it can be kind of sensationalized, or because people it can how do I put it? Um, it can kind of create a reaction in people more so than something that's more dry and academic.
Yeah, I mean, I love talking about language. It's not necessarily my expertise given what I study, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And there's a reason why I chose to use the term thought as opposed to some of the other terms that you're seeing floating around. So a little bit background on this phenomenon and sort of the language as I understand it. So the 78 paper introduced this idea of imposter phenomenon. In the early 80s and mid 80s, a lot of these scholars who were working on this construct, especially the seminal scholars, the original scholars of this work, decided to actually go sort of the non-academic path. So they decided to actually write a popular press book. And so that popular press book sort of kind of used the word imposter phenomenon, but I think when they were loosely talking to sort of people more broadly, they would sometimes introduce the term syndrome. And I think part of that, I can only speculate as to why syndrome has really taken off. I think part of it is we like to diagnose ourselves, and syndrome feels medical, it feels clinical, it feels like I can say, oh, I have this thing and other people don't have this thing. But even the original scholars, Sloan and Imes, will say that they made a mistake by using the word syndrome. And the reason for that is if you think about the word syndrome, it's kind of trait-like. So what that means is it's this idea that it's going to be stable. Syndrome also suggests that there's sort of a constellation of particular characteristics. And that's not necessarily the case that everybody is going to hold all those characteristics. So we can even go back to the distinction we just made a minute ago between the idea that others overestimate you and this notion of fear of being found out. So one thing is if you're thinking about it as a syndrome, you're then going to say that everybody necessarily needs to have all of those characteristics, which may or may not be true. Just like the story I told you about the person who has the thoughts, but doesn't necessarily feel the fear, or at least to the same extent that maybe others might say that they do. And so part of that, but at the same time, when you have that really catchy term of I get to say I have imposter syndrome and you don't have it and I have it, I really think this is something that the media caught up on. It's something that the everyday person sort of found sexy and interesting. And so that's why we're kind of not seeing it dissipate. What's interesting, though, is in the academic literature, particularly within the last 5 years, you are starting to see many scholars, including me and others, who are starting to say, hey, actually, this can be a state. That is, this can be something that you experience sometimes and not other times. And that notion, by the way, is not completely crazy or new. If you look at the 78 paper, they will say that, like, hey, some of the patients, the clinical subjects in their population didn't necessarily experience this all the time. They would talk about very discrete experiences in which they experienced these thoughts and sort of how that drove their behaviors. And so when I tackled this phenomenon and decided to reintroduce it to the management literature, I was very purposeful in sort of choosing my terminology. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So one is trying to push back against sort of the popular narrative, which a lot of my research is, like every paper is trying to figure out, okay, what's another thing in the popular narrative that we think about that may not be necessarily true or is not wholly true. But another part of it is also to help scholars get really clear about what they're talking about. So because most of the discussion is happening in the popular press, as scholars, we're not immune to what's going on in mainstream discussions, right? So we also might be sort of reading those mainstream discussions and using those mainstream discussions to also characterize or help us understand the phenomenon that we're looking at. And so part of it is me saying, okay, I'm using thoughts. When I use thoughts, that's to help you distinguish it from maybe a bunch of other conceptions that you might be thinking about. But I'm going to be really clear about, hey, when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about this idea that others overestimate your abilities.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, language is funny because if I hear imposter syndrome, then the first thing I do is I Google it, and then I find a list of symptoms, and then I say, well, I have all of those, or I think I do. Or if it's some other syndrome, again, I Google it, I have those, and you kind of, like you said, you self-diagnose yourself. Yeah, that is the danger.
It is,
Um,
I'm sure medical doctors everywhere are like, the advent of Google, good in some ways, maybe not so great in other ways. And my patients come in and are like, I have this disease.
I've been there. I mean, with Google and other websites where people share anecdotes about what they experience with various things, and then you have this bias where you identify with things even if you don't really have them, or if you have them in varying degrees, you assume you have them to the same degree.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know if I would use the one word fun, but as humans, we enjoy categorizing ourselves. We enjoy categorizing others. We enjoy categorizing ourselves. So anytime there's an opportunity to put myself in a category, I might have sort of this urge or this, motivation or at least liking of this opportunity to do so.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Um,
the other thing I always think about with language with this term, I don't know if this is where you want to go, but is also the connotation. So when you think about the word imposter syndrome, there's some very strong connotations for both of those words. So for imposter, it brings back negative ideas. It's this idea of like, oh, I'm a swindler, I'm sort of grifter or whatever it might be. And syndrome, again, sounds like a medical condition, not good to have some sort of syndrome. And so the other thing about my research is trying to say, hey, this is another misconception that probably even comes from the words itself. We assume if I tell you something is imposter syndrome, that brings about all these sort of negative associations. And so it's perfectly normal for me to think that, oh, this is a really bad thing to have. And so it's perfectly normal for all of us to start to think, oh, this is something I need to overcome. This is so bad. There cannot be any bright sides associated with it.
yeah, totally. Yeah, I got thinking about imposter as well. So after I was done with syndrome, I was thinking about imposter, and I thought, yeah, that has issues too. And I got thinking, well, if I were to rename it, what would I call it? And I don't know what you think of this, like perceived overestimation bias or overestimation bias. Like just be clear about what the thing is instead of alluding to some metaphor or some other image.
I would love that. I think that's great. The only thing that I would say about that is it sort of leads us to have a big discussion about, well, is this related to confidence or underconfidence or
Mhm.
something like that, which is a whole nother discussion. And there's some great scholars, particularly at Berkeley and other places, who have been studying overconfidence. And they really use this word of overestimation. So yeah, it's really funny how very specific words just sort of take you on different paths and potentially bring to mind other associations with other concepts.
Yeah. Uh, and I don't know much about psychology, but I'm wondering, is there like a regulatory body that decides what to call things, or do scholars publish a paper and decide what something ought to be called?
It's pretty funny. So I would say it's actually, as academics, we come up with our terms and we hope that other people will agree with our terms. There is obviously the peer review process, and I'm sure some reviewers might push back on certain terms. But I actually think this is why we have so many terms that some people are like, this seems really imprecise, or this seems more precise or less precise. I mean, even if you think about the word imposter phenomenon, part of the reason they switched over to saying something like a syndrome, it's because phenomenon is also such a broad term. It's almost like, what does phenomenon mean? And so I think part of probably why we're seeing this evolution in terms of the terminology is because it started off so general, in part because that's almost a safe term to use, maybe. Reviewers are less likely to sort of push back, like, oh, yeah, it's a phenomenon, and they called it imposter. Okay, that makes sense. And now you're sort of starting to see people being like, no, 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 let's get really specific about what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Um, I read somewhere that these thoughts can start in childhood when a child is overpraised, when they're told they're great at everything, or when they're labeled, like we were saying, you turn into your labels sometimes. Do we still believe that's the case, that these things, these thoughts could begin in childhood?
That is super interesting. So I typically have not looked at sort of these sort of childhood antecedents. We do know that there is some literature. So I have a review paper that came out in January that looked at sort of combing the literature, whether it's in psychology, education, management, medicine. And some people do suggest that sort of parental styles or things that happen in the classroom could be precursors. I think really when I'm thinking about an antecedent, I think it needs to sort of meet two different criteria, or at least two. So the first is kind of this idea that you've had some success. And the second is that you've received feedback on that success. So if you've not received any feedback on a previous success, then you're unlikely to experience these thoughts. And so this is kind of another thing that sort of really was puzzling for me when I first started thinking about this phenomenon, because if we think it's something that you need to overcome, but if I'm telling you at the same time, people who are successful have experienced this, it kind of introduces two questions. It could introduce the question of like, okay, did these people succeed in spite of it? Or might it actually be something that sort of helps them, or at least hasn't necessarily hindered them along the way? And so thinking about that, what it sort of leads us to think about is this is something that capable people experience. And so it's almost like maybe a natural part of a capable person's experience, especially if they're putting themselves in a growth situation.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Um, one other question, and then I'll move to the workplace, which I know is where your research is in. Um, is it fair to say that people in creative fields maybe are I don't know if I would use the word more, but let's say more prone to imposter thoughts because others might read into their work. So I put out a movie and then someone reads some hidden message in it that I didn't intend, and then I'm faced with this dilemma. Do I own up to it and say that I can actually the simpler plainer message is what I intended, or do I kind of pretend like yeah I'm as deep as you think I am?
I love this question. So okay, a couple things. So I think when we think about prone, or, if I'm thinking about where am I going to go out in the world to study this, I'm going to study it in fields in which there is a subjective standard of success. So in that sense, creative could be a great space to look at. And I'll allude to some ongoing research in a minute. But I wouldn't necessarily say that creatives are more prone. It's just that creatives are likely to experience this. Maybe because of exactly what you just said, which is that there isn't this gold standard of, this is what the best work looks like, and this is what the next best work looks like, and this is what the third best work looks like. Really, they're actually evolving standards. It's influenced by sort of the zeitgeist of the current zeitgeist. And so in that sense, I would think that creatives are likely to experience it, or at least I definitely would go about studying them. I actually do have some ongoing work, which I hope to talk about more when it goes through the peer review process, but really looking at sort of this connection between workplace imposter thoughts and creativity. Because something that you've just suggested is it because I'm a creative that leads me to have workplace imposter thoughts? I kind of think about it maybe in the opposite direction,
Mm.
which is that it could be also workplace imposter thoughts could sort of impact creativity, whether it's big C creativity, which is sort of like this idea of like what is the big creative sort of producing, or everyday creativity that we're all engaging in. So when we're at work, when we're in life, we are encountering problems. And sometimes I think imposter thoughts potentially, or I argue that perhaps imposter thoughts might sometimes be beneficial for that everyday creativity, that everyday problem solving that you might engage in, that will lead you to say, oh yeah, I came up with some creative ideas today to sort of navigate my life.
Nice, nice. Wonderful. All right. So I know we've got like maybe 10 minutes. So I wanted to move to the bulk of your research, which is about imposter thoughts in the workplace. I heard you say in an interview that you were working as a consultant, and then it was at that point in your life that you started thinking about imposter thoughts and correct me if I'm wrong, in the workplace, and then you went to graduate school and did research into that field. But also, one of your findings off the back of that research was that it's not all bad. If we have imposter thoughts in the workplace, there are actually some positive effects that we get. And I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So let me tell you a brief story of the journey and then dive into that piece of research, which I'm very excited about. Um, so I had done some research as an undergrad in sort of what is called microorganizational behavior, which is what I call the psychology of work. But I decided that I wanted to go into general management consulting. And so that is what I did post graduation. I moved to Chicago, joined an awesome firm. And in that experience, I was working on a lot of different teams. And I realized I thought the client work was interesting, but I realized what was more interesting was actually analyzing sort of the dynamics of sort of the teams I was on and just seeing how work functioned and how people sort of navigated their work lives. And so that actually sort of pushed me to go back to grad school. And in my first year of grad school, we had, a series of classes. And one of the classes was, okay, let's practice, writing a full academic paper as if you had already done a ton of research and you were writing it up. And I had gotten the advice of like, it'd be so great if you used your classes to actually sort of study something that you're interested in. And so the first, I would say, 3 weeks of that class, I kept sending little memos to a professor in the department, being like, what about this idea? What about this idea? And I kept getting, nope, not good. Nope, try again. Nope, try again. And then I remember sending an email about imposter syndrome, in part because I am what I study. And I think a lot of people have experienced this. And I basically got an email to the suggestion of like, bingo. And so I was like, okay, like this is it. This is what I have. But I then quickly realized that the research really wasn't quite there. So this is how I sort of came to those conclusions of what we talked about earlier of like, hey, a lot of this work is happening, in the sort of mainstream discussion, not necessarily happening in the sort of scholarly journals of the story. And so that actually led to some funny moments of professors coming into my little cubicle and seeing like New York Times, Cosmopolitan, and then like an academic journal. And they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, no, I promise. Like I'm really looking into this phenomenon and trying to get an understanding. But one of the big things was trying to figure out, okay, what are some big misconceptions? We've already talked about a few. But the first one that I really wanted to tackle is exactly what you just mentioned, which is this idea of can it have upside? And so I did a number of studies. So the first study was a finance firm based in the Mid-Atlantic region. And there I just wanted to see proof of concept. Could we see that people who had imposter thoughts for these finance employees, could they be potentially rated as more interpersonally effective? Controlling for things that we might care about. So could I sort of rule out things like, oh, well, maybe actually they're being rated as more interpersonally effective because they're actually just better performers, or maybe, they're actually just more experienced or whatever it might be. And so I found this initial proof of concept that suggested, hey, finance employees who thought that others overestimated them at work seemed to be rated by their supervisors as more interpersonally effective. So I was like, Howdy, this is great, amazing. Like, let's go to the next stage. So then I actually happened to be friends with a number of people in the medical field. And so I had just been chatting. It was a sort of dinner party. I've been chatting to them about this research that I'm doing. And they were like, you should study us. And I was like, okay, well, let me look into this. And so this actually led me to partner with a medical school that had these sort of patient simulations. So as part of medical training, essentially these doctors in training, it could be also doctors later in later stages of their careers, would interact with standardized patients. Standardized patients are basically people from the local area. They actually tend to be actors in real life. So maybe they also work in theater in the city. And what's great about these standardized patients is they truly are standardized. So what that means is they actually all get trained to act as if they have certain symptoms. They get trained on exactly how to respond to questions. and to make sure that they're actually all interacting in the exact same way. When they're not interacting with a patient, they're sitting in this control room, which I can describe because I also sat in this control room, which basically had a bunch of videos, and you could actually listen in on other people's interactions to make sure that when it's your turn to go into a room, you knew exactly how Joe and the other sort of session interacted. And so what that meant is everything that was happening in that interaction is going to be happening on the doctor's side, because the patient side is very controlled. So anything I see, it's not because the patient was acting differently, it's probably something with the doctor. So with the doctors, I was like, okay, this would be really cool to study doctors who have imposter thoughts interacting with these patients, because it's a very standardized experience. And so I could sort of diagnose or at least figure out what is happening as a result of having imposter thoughts. So with these doctors, about a week before the interaction that they all had to go through, I asked them to give me their sense of imposter thoughts. And then during the interaction, we actually video recorded a portion of these interactions. And then for all of the interactions, patients were trained to give sort of interpersonal effectiveness ratings for all of these doctors. And then just for fun, I also asked these doctors to give me a sense of like, what diagnosis would you give for each of these patients? And what I found was that doctors who had more frequent imposter thoughts were rated as more interpersonally effective by these patients. They did not get the diagnoses more or less incorrect, which is good, because, you know, if they're warmer or great to be around, that's not so great if they still get the diagnosis wrong. So we're not seeing that to be the case. And then when we analyzed what was actually going on in the videos, so we had an awesome team of MIT and Wellesley RAs who sort of coded the behaviors. What I saw was that those who had more imposter thoughts, those doctors who expressed those thoughts, were being much warmer in conversation. So much more other oriented. They were making a lot of hand gestures. They were doing better eye contact. They were nodding a lot more. And so then I did 2 subsequent experiments to really get at causality, to really show that, hey, this seems to be the case. But essentially, if you have imposter thoughts, you sort of are more other oriented. And as a result of that other orientedness, other people are sort of seeing you as a better person to work with.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So to summarize, doctors with imposter thoughts were as competent, but more interpersonally effective.
Yeah, that is a great summary. It was like perfect. I was like always happy to get into the nitty gritty, but I love that clear line.
And I love in one of your papers you talk about it as a defense response. I think you use those words, and it got me thinking like that's a good pattern for a lot of the things that we experience. So we, in terms of imposter thoughts, actually I have it here. So you said we feel our self-esteem is under attack, and so we put out we domain switch and we put out interpersonal effectiveness to feel better or to mask maybe that attack or to deal with it somehow.
Yeah, so I think the theory, or at least the theory of what I think is going on, is that it's almost this sort of subconscious sort of process. So whenever we feel our sort of self-esteem being attacked, we naturally do a bunch of things to try and get our self-esteem back to the level it was, or to protect ourselves. Most people think of sort of maybe self-sabotaging or self-handicapping as a potential pathway or reactions you have to this. But we also have some pretty adaptive things, or things that we might not realize are adaptive. And domain switching is sort of one of them. This idea of, okay, if we think about 2 really key domains of life, we think about our ability domain and our warmth domain, and so competence and warmth. And so essentially what we're seeing here is potentially this trade-off of like, I think other people think I'm not as smart, so let me actually sort of turn up the charm and then sort of see where that goes.
Mm, wonderful. All right, I know we have a few more minutes, Basima. Just to show you what an amateur I am. Actually, Zoom is telling me that my call is gonna be ended in 7 minutes because I didn't pay for the the paid plan. So maybe just 2 questions. One question is sort of the main thing I was wondering about a few years ago when I got thinking about this stuff. You talk about imposter thoughts having this upside, making us more interpersonally effective. But on a practical, in a practical sense, does it help with things like career progress or promotions at work?
That is something that I've been thinking deeply about. So the way I would sort of tackle this is probably if you have a high interpersonal component at work, or your sort of performance is more subjective. So it's not like you're in a factory making a particular set of widgets where people can really count, okay, you made 10 widgets today and yesterday you made 5 widgets. I think it can be sort of a pathway to success. because there tends to be a halo effect of like, if I think you're a nice person to work with and I think you're great to work with, I'm probably more likely to also rate you as higher on other sort of dimensions. And so what's particularly tricky is in most workplaces, you're not going to be able to disentangle this because of the halo effect. So the most people who are rating you probably on your relationship skills are probably also the same ones rating you on your project skills. So what this means is, yeah, I do think imposter thoughts can be sort of something that helps you get there. But I also think you have to be in the right conditions. So another way of thinking about your questions, the question is actually thinking more broadly about sort of what are maybe sort of three things we care about at work. We probably care about, your performance, your job performance. That's always a big one. We probably, given, how interactive the world is, I know we had a lot of people moving remote, but we're also seeing a lot of return to office. We care about sort of your interpersonal skills. And then we probably also, at least to some extent, care about employee well-being, because if our employees are not feeling good, it's likely to impact their performance. And so the way that I think about this is, okay, so what the research sort of suggests now, or my research, it suggests that imposter thoughts can be really good for your interpersonal performance. It probably sort of the effects on job performance are a little bit more contingent. So if we're thinking about it through operating through interpersonal performance, yeah, it could be good for your job performance, but we're not seeing sort of a strong relationship. It sort of suggests that there are situations that can make it good or bad. But then what we do have is also a very consistent understanding that it's not good for your well-being. So what I mean by that is we do know that imposter thoughts cause anxiety. You're more likely to report that you are less satisfied at work, that you're less committed. And so what does that mean if we're putting all those things together? What it means is that I probably want to think about where you sit in an organization before saying that, hey, I think your imposter thoughts are going to be good for your performance versus not. So imagine you are a sort of solo entrepreneur, or you are a software engineer who's not really interacting with others. You're working on a particular piece of code, and that is where you're sitting. And you don't really interact at work with anybody, and maybe you live at home by yourself. For those people, I'm going to be particularly worried if they have imposter thoughts, because they're unlikely to get the interpersonal benefits because they're not getting feedback from others that, hey, you're a great person to work with. They're not having those interactions to sort of help buffer their self-esteem and do that sort of trade-off. From an employee well-being perspective, they're likely to feel anxious because they're not able to buffer. And so what we would expect then is this is probably going to have downstream effects on job performance in a negative way. Now let's take a different type of person. Let's take a person who is maybe the lead of a team. They're in the office 5 days a week. Their whole team is in the office, and a lot of their work is very interpersonally oriented. For those people, what you're probably going to see is you are going to see that interpersonal benefit. You are probably also still going to see a hit on employee well-being because that seems to be consistent. But the idea is that maybe that interpersonal sort of benefit is going to sort of at least cancel out or help offset some of that well-being. And as a result, maybe their job performance is actually going to be pretty good too, because it's being fed by their interpersonal effectiveness. And so overall, the net benefit for them is significantly higher than sort of the first employee I talked about, who's the solo entrepreneur or the software engineer.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So it's a little bit more complicated.
It always is, yeah. But that was really insightful. Basima, I know we're over time, so thank you very much. I really appreciate your thoughts on and I'll link to your work. There are a few things I didn't get to, so I'll link to the measure that you share in your papers that helps us figure out if maybe we fit into this category, and then add some notes around your work. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really great chatting.